Welcome to On the Issues. I'm your host, Nicholas Balassi, and today we have a great guest. We're with political analyst and author David Lewis of Princeton University. Mr. Lewis, I want to thank you for taking some time to come on the show.
My pleasure.
And starting with the 2008 presidential race, because that has gotten a lot of coverage on the news, do you feel that these candidates are campaigning too early?
Well, I think in this environment, you have to campaign early. The different states have moved their primaries and caucuses up earlier, and that means you have to start campaigning earlier. The figure I heard was that the top candidates on both sides are trying to raise $100 million in this campaign year, which is, if you think about it, $300,000 a day at least. And if you want to raise that kind of money, you got to get out early, you got to talk to people, and you got to get your message out there. And these candidates are doing what it makes sense for them to do.
Is this something that is just absurd, because that's before the election year, raising that kind of money?
It's getting to the point where it's getting difficult to defend it. Certainly, as a political scientist, yeah, it's crazy. I mean, qualified candidates are going to be dropping out really early, and the reason is that they just realize they can't raise the money, they can't get the campaign staff to work for them that they need, they can't get the endorsements that they need from political people. And decisions are being made in the political process so much before a vote has even been cast. And that, I think, is not a great way to do a presidential election.
Now, you mentioned candidates are going to be dropping out early. Are you surprised candidates on the Republican side like Huckabee and on the Democratic side, Dodd and Kucinich, haven't dropped out yet?
I'm a little surprised, to be honest. I think that part of the story is that you might get some of these people staying in to be considered as vice presidential candidates. So I say that in particular about Huckabee. So the problem that the main Republican candidates have is holding in the right? So none of them are particularly attractive to the right. So Giuliani's got issues with abortion and with gay rights and his sort of different marriages. Romney is a Mormon, which doesn't pull in the evangelical right. McCain has never been a darling of the right, and as a consequence, there is some sense in which Huckabee might be the guy who's brought in as vice president to hold that part of the party in when we get to the general election. And so there's a sense that he may be hanging around for that reason. Dodd and Kucinich, Kucinich is going to be in for a while, I think, partly because he just wants to get his message out there, and so he's not going to spend the kind of money that the main candidates are going to spend. But he's just going to sort of stick it out for ideological reasons. Dodd, I don't expect him to be in much longer, frankly. He does have some support on Wall Street and again in sort of the business component of the Democratic Party. I don't consider him being one of the main ones, but he may have the same kind of aspirations, that he's sort of a well-regarded Democrat who's had experience in a variety of areas, and in particular, he sort of speaks to the economic side of the Democratic Party.
I think talking about all these candidates and them possibly dropping out, it makes sense to go through each one individually and maybe talk about some of their characteristics. We have Kucinich, who during the 2008 presidential debate said, I believe the Democrats should go forth with impeachment. Why do you believe they haven't even put impeachment on the table since they took control of Congress?
Well, I just don't think it's politically viable for the party to do that. I think that they recognize that that it's divisive, that it was politically damaging when the Republicans did it, and they're going to lose the conservative Democrats that are essential to the coalition. They're going to do more damage within the party than otherwise. And I just don't think the party can do it. Kucinich is way out to the left in the party, and he's not speaking for a majority of Democrats when he thinks that there should be impeachment. And in some ways, it's easy for him to say it. He's relatively safe. He's sort of out on the fringes of the party, and he's catering to party people when he's sort of saying these things. If you're running the Democratic Party in Congress and you need to sort of keep your agenda going and sort of hold people in line who are relatively conservative relative to Kucinich, you just can't put those kind of issues on the agenda because it distracts from the agenda that you want to get passed, and it creates divisions that are going to make it hard for you to govern later on.
We hear critics say, well, the Republicans impeached President Clinton, although he talked his way out of it, but they impeached him, and George W. Bush won the election after Clinton finished his term. Do you think that line of thinking maybe plays a part in the fact that Democrats are saying, well, if we did go forth with impeachment, it may not hurt our party?
Well, I don't think that Kucinich's opinion is a popular one among Democrats. I mean that by Democrats being Democrats in office. I don't think that they feel like they want to put their political careers at risk over this issue. So if you remember, it is true. I mean, so impeachment happens, but who gets blamed for impeachment? Well, it's the members of Congress who brought the charges and sort of argued the case. So Rogan and people like that in the Republican Party, look, they're out of office. So if you're a member of Congress and you're trying to decide, should we put this on the agenda or not, you're thinking that. You're not thinking about the presidential election. I don't think that people are going to sort of tarnish the sort of candidates themselves unless they come out and, in favor of themselves.
And Rudy Giuliani, who's winning a lot of the national polls, is that something that surprises you on the Republican side?
To be honest with you, I do. It is surprising to me. He's not a typical Republican candidate in the sense that, while he has the kind of commander-in-chief, I was in charge during 9/11 component to him, which many Republican candidates do. I mean, Republicans, sort of apart from this administration, have tended to have an advantage in foreign affairs and management type issues. And Giuliani kind of fits that mold in the sense that, look, I've been, in charge during a crisis and so forth. And I, according to sort of popular perceptions, did a good job in New York when I was there. But he doesn't, sort of speak to other sort of bread and butter Republican issues. People don't think of him when they think of tax cuts necessarily. They don't think of him when they think about abortion or gay rights. And so I'm surprised that he's doing as well as he's doing. And in some ways, I think, part of his attractiveness is that there isn't a viable alternative to him that has those characteristics either. None of the other main Republican candidates have those features, and so they're all sort of weak in some ways. And I also wonder the extent to which he's going to diminish under the national sort of spotlight as we get closer to casting votes and when people start paying more attention to these debates. I wonder what people's perceptions are going to be, because you can only go so far on 9/11. Look, there's a big difference between being the mayor of a large city and being the president of the United States. And, we'll see whether he can hold up under the strain of a campaign that, like I said, is just unbelievably demanding at this point in American history.
Are there any specific characteristics about him that you think will hurt him as time goes on?
Well, I think he came off as being, compassionate and sort of in charge at the same time when he was mayor of New York. Perceptions about him were much different before 9/11 in terms of his divisiveness within the city and people's perceptions of his accomplishments. And I wonder whether he'll have the same national perception as somebody like Bob Dole, who came off during the 1996 campaign, even earlier in his career, as being kind of mean-spirited, a little bit tough, a little bit acerbic. And look, you're going to be under tremendous pressure and in the spotlight all the time when you're on the campaign. And I just wonder whether he's going to be able to sustain this sort of perception that people have of him now as being, not that guy. I don't know what he's like really, right? But we're going to find out during the campaign. And so my expectations ahead of time were that he would have some trouble under the national spotlight, and we'll find out whether that's true.
I've been doing a lot of research on the candidates and finding out a lot of interesting things about them. Giuliani being that he was married to his second cousin for 14 years, and he's on his third wife. And I think he divorced his second wife during a press conference, different things like that. Is that a sign that moral issues may not play as much of a part in this election as the previous one?
Well, we'll find out. What's interesting about the Republican Party at this point in history is the extent to which being a Republican in different parts of the country means different things. So I do think in places like New York and New Jersey, being a Republican means there's less focus on sort of social issues, and those issues aren't as important. What's important is sort of economic issues. And, so that I think that plays fine here. In terms of moral issues, in the Republican Party, are they becoming less important? I mean, it's hard to say that, given the extent to which they're important in President Bush's support. I don't think things like that change overnight. The proof's going to be when people start casting votes, and when people start making decisions about whether they're going to turn out, when they start making decisions about whether they're going to give money, when they start making decisions about whether they're going to talk to their friends about Giuliani. And I think the evidence thus far suggests that Giuliani is not exciting that part of the Republican Party. That in fact, if you compare just numbers, fundraising numbers between the two parties, the Democratic candidates are outraising the Republican candidates, all of them, by a significant amount, which suggests to me that there are real problems on the Republican side, not just for Giuliani, but also for Romney and McCain.
How about Fred Thompson? Do you think he should have declared his candidacy earlier?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, I understand the strategy that he was taking, right? Was that he kind of thought, I'm going to be perceived as the candidate who comes in and solves the Republican Party's problem. I can be the new Reagan. And I think that, I can understand making that decision. Should he have gotten in earlier? I don't think that he would have been as viable early on because people had to recognize a need for him before he got in. I just think that people have been disappointed with him as a candidate. That is, I'm not sure. Look, you got to really have a fire in the belly to do this. I think he wants to be president. I'm not persuaded that he wants to campaign. And so he's been, I think, on the campaign trail disappointing. I think that had it been somebody else, maybe there would have been a different story and it would have been the right decision to make. I'm not sure the decision, in other words, I'm not sure the decision of when to get in was pivotal for him. It does strategically put you at a disadvantage. And the disadvantages are twofold. One disadvantage is that it means that you're raising money less quickly. People aren't going to give money as aggressively if they aren't sure whether you're going to run or not. And the other thing is that what's really important in modern nomination politics now is endorsements and a sense of consensus building among party elites. And that can't happen if you're not in the race. And so I think front runners and people who are in early do have something of an advantage. And so it is an uphill climb if you get in late. Now, that doesn't mean you'll never do it or that there aren't other sort of compensatory advantages to doing that, but it's a risky strategy to play for sure.
Because he started really high in the polls when he wasn't even a candidate. And then it seems that when he declared his candidacy, the polls went down and Giuliani was gaining a lot of ground.
Yeah, I mean, this is the difficulty that that all presidential candidates face, right? In the sense that people who don't know much about you, but just sort of have some sense for who you are and what your record was, will think more or less highly about you. They don't have any reason to sort of critique you or develop negative opinions about you. And the longer the campaign goes on, the more people learn about you, the more they realize that you may not have the same views as they do. So this is a real difference between, say, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, right? So Obama's positives were, through the roof. Everybody thought this guy's great and, he's wonderful. Hillary's in a different situation. People know who she is. They know what she stands for. She's got a long track record. She's been in the White House. She's been in the Senate. And one of the concerns about her is these sort of high negatives that she has, that there are people have strong opinions about her one way or the other. With Obama, he had the initial advantage of, look, he seems like an excellent candidate, a good record, interesting personal history, and so people think highly about him. Where the rub is once people sort of start pushing and people start attacking him, and he gets out on the road and people, sort of see what he looks like on the stump and goes to fundraisers and whether people give him money or not. And, the more people learn, the better able they are to place you. So they may think about you positively at the beginning, but then you've got to sort of, keep the momentum. And with Thompson, I think what became clear was that he was underwhelming on the campaign trail once he kind of got going.
George W. Bush was famous for saying, I don't listen to the polls. They don't matter to me. I don't read the paper and this and that during when he was running for presidency the second time. Do you think these polls are accurate when we hear all these numbers about who's winning and who's not?
Well, I think they're pretty, there's a lot of room for movement in these polls. So I don't put a whole lot of stake in the polls at this point, partly because people just don't know much about the candidates, right? So they might be able to recognize their name, but they don't know what they stand for yet. That's differs across states, right? So if you live in Iowa or you live in New Hampshire, you live in, I guess this year in Nevada, people are going to know a little bit more about you than otherwise, and so maybe those polls mean a little bit more. Look, it's a fun parlor game to keep track of these polls and figure out who's doing well and who's doing poorly. The one group that does pay attention are the sort of party elites that are trying to both pick a candidate that's consistent with their ideology but also can win in the general election. And so they'll pay some attention to kind of who's ahead and what they think about that person. So it can matter there. But again, there's a lot of variability in these polls at this stage, a lot of undecideds, a lot of people who just don't have much information. And they'll solidify the closer we get to the campaigns.
Now, how about somebody like Ron Paul, who is one of the only Republican who voted against the 2002 resolution to disarm Iraq. Do you think he should be picking up more support? Does it surprise you that he's not getting as much?
Well, it's a difficult position for a Republican to be in, to sort of be the anti-war Republican. Ron Paul's a quirky guy in general, so he's not really, sort of more on the libertarian part of the, of the Republican Party, and so he doesn't vote with the party as much as he should. He's not seen as a team player, and so, look, when you're trying to win the nomination, it is partly a party game, and so even though we have primaries and those are important, if you don't play the party game, people aren't going to support you, and so that's why he has sort of an insurgent campaign. The sort of internet and this kind of stuff. It's not really driven through party leaders because, frankly, I don't think they like him very much. And plus, the Republican voters are the ones who are less concerned about the Iraq War and most likely to support it or support the president. And so that doesn't get a lot of traction in a nomination campaign. It'd get more traction in a general election campaign.
I wonder if a Republican emerged that it was anti-war and still wasn't as much of a libertarian as Ron Paul, if he would pick up that needed support that a lot of the other candidates have been getting trouble picking up.
Yeah, again, I don't know how much it helps you on the Republican side to have been against the war. So remember that if it's the general election, you're trying to do two things at one time. One is you're trying to pick up the people in the middle, right? So you're trying to peel off independents and you're trying to peel off more moderate Democrats. And in that kind of an election, having that kind of a stance, I think, helps you. The other thing you're trying to do in a general election is to sort of hold on to the base, the people on the on the extremes of the ideological spectrum that kind of got you into power. In the nomination campaign, you're not worried about the people in the middle. You're worried about the people on the right, and the people on the right in the Republican campaign are the ones who are most likely to have supported the initial decision, most likely to support the president, and so for them, it's not as salient an issue as it is on the Democratic side, where every Democratic candidate is talking about the war. And the Republican candidates will talk about it too, but it doesn't have the red meat quality that it does on the Democratic side.
Moving on to the Democratic side, we have Hillary Clinton, whose poll numbers are slipping. She was 30% above Obama, and now she's 19%. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, so again, this is one of these things where there are natural trends in nomination campaigns. That is, there's always a period during the nomination campaign where there's a front runner, somebody who's sort of the establishment candidate who's gone out and has long-standing connections, has raised a lot of money, has gotten endorsements, where that front-running candidate has a period where somebody sort of comes along and takes away some of their support. And I think she's going through that right now. It remains to be seen whether Obama is viable or not. I mean, it matters a lot in this period. Like I said, look, what you need are, there's a small world of campaign professionals on the Democratic side, so you need to get those people, and the people who are in early and have relationships have those people. You need to raise money, and it's not like there's unlimited money. You need to have connections with big donors, and Hillary certainly does that from her time in the White House, and so she's able to raise money and raise it early and raise it well. And then you need endorsements, people who have relationships with you that are willing to come out publicly and support you, and she has an advantage there. So those things can help you ride through difficult times in the campaign. I think that people feel like Obama's an exciting new candidate. I do think that he's helped by his position on the war, whereas Hillary has sort of had that connection to her. I do think that people on the left are more excited about Obama than they are maybe about Hillary. But again, these people are making decisions about who can win in the general election, how good is their candidacy at this point. And so to be honest with you, I expect that you should expect that she's going to have some decrease in support, but I think she'll pick it back up. At least that's my expectation now.
All right. Now, Hillary Clinton with Obama, they've been talking a lot during the debate about a variety of issues, but the war has not been getting as much coverage, according to people like Chris Matthews, who I spoke to at the 2008 the presidential debate in Philadelphia. And he's saying, if this patty cake doesn't stop, there's going to be a problem. Hillary's position is hard to take, and Barack Obama is somewhere between the hawks and the doves, he said. So what do you think about that?
Well, let me. So there's a couple parts of this, right? So one is I'm not sure I agree with Matthews. I'm not sure that they're hurt by not distinguishing themselves on the war at this stage. I'm not sure, right? I'd have to be persuaded. I mean, they're all talking about the war, right? And they're all saying the Bush administration has made a hash of things, and for them that's fine. I don't know how much political benefit you gain as a Democrat by saying, "Here's my plan. Here's what exactly I'm going to do," because on the one hand, the people who are the most likely to be active in the party, the people who are most likely to be attentive, are those who are most ideological and want you to say, we're going to pull out now. And that may help you with some segment of the Democratic Party, but then you've got to go in the general election and you've got to say, here's my plan for Iraq. And in that, pulling out now isn't as viable a strategy. And you may have to govern with that promise down the road. And so those candidates who have a legitimate chance of running in the general election and actually winning, and I think the Democrats do have a good chance of winning, are constrained by both the general election and the necessity to govern. And if you run on a platform where your plan is to set deadlines that are very close or to pull people out right away, you really put yourself in danger, right? What happens if you're in a civil war, right? A civil war breaks out. Is the U.S. going to stand aside and not go back in? Or what happens if it turns out the terrorists are being trained in Iraq after we pull out, and that we're at greater danger than we are now? What are we going to sort of stand by and let that happen? Absolutely not. And so there's a sense in which it's very difficult for any presidential candidate to sort of say, here's exactly what we're going to do, because I don't think it's responsible to say you're going to pull out right away without any sort of contingency plan. And explaining contingency plans isn't really popular in a campaign, particularly in a nomination campaign.
If it turns out that Giuliani is the nominee for the Republicans and Hillary is for the Democrats, where do you think they're going to campaign when the general election comes? New York's going to be tough because they're both pretty moderate. What do you think about the South?
Okay, so where are they going to campaign? Well, I'd have to take a closer look at the numbers to see how in play New York really would be if Giuliani was running. It historically has voted Democratic pretty solidly. And so we tend to see each of the campaigns will divide up the states into kind of safe Democratic states, safe Republican states, lean Democratic, lean Republican, and then these set of battleground states. And Republicans tend to do well in the L, that is sort of the sort of interior West, Midwest through the South, and the Democrats tend to do well on the coasts, and then there's a series of battleground states that are sort of up. And I think that the battleground states that we saw in 2004 are going to be repeated again in 2008. So we see Florida, right? We see Pennsylvania, we see New Mexico, perhaps Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin. New Jersey historically has been a bellwether, although lately it's been going more Democratic than it did before. And so they're really going to focus on these battleground states. I mean, some states, Hillary can campaign in Alabama all she wants, but she's never going to win the state. And but she might have some concerns about Tennessee and Arkansas, and so maybe she can chip away there where somebody else couldn't.
Democrats seem to think that this election is in the bag, that the fundraising is doing well, and they're going to win in 2008. Do you think they shouldn't think this way?
Well, I would never advise someone to think that it's in the bag, but I think that they have reason for optimism. I think that the issues that people are talking about now tend to work in their favor, and the fundraising advantage that they have is certainly a promising sign for them. That is, they seem to be generating a lot more interest and support financially and volunteer-wise than the Republicans are, and that I think bodes well for them in the general election. And so I do think that they have reason to be optimistic. Now, we've got a whole campaign to go through. We don't even know who the nominees are going to be or what the issues are going to be. So, for example, there could be some outside shock to the political system that changes the whole dynamic of the campaign, right? If there was another terrorist attack, for example, that could change the whole dynamic of the campaign and what is salient to people when they vote. So we know, for example, that if you look at sort of voters in northern New Jersey, they're more likely to vote on issues of security, right? Because they tend to know people who were involved in 9/11, who were they sort of sensed the palpable fear of terrorist attacks more concretely than people in other parts. So if that issue, for example, is made more salient by some event, then that could change the whole dynamic of the campaign. But if things stay more or less like they are now, then the Democrats at least have an advantage, I think, heading into the general election.
The Democratic Congress's approval rating is lower than President Bush's. Do you think this trend, if it continues, will affect the Democratic nominee?
That's a good question. I don't think so. When presidents campaign for office, they like to give off the impression that everything depends on them. And so, even somebody like Ross Perot, who had very little chance of working successfully with Congress, I would argue, because he has no connections to people in Congress, could argue, I'm going to go to Washington and we're going to work together and we're going to get things done. It's easier for a presidential candidate to say that because they have usually about half the chamber, or maybe sometimes more, people to talk with. So I think that presidents encourage and voters tend to believe that presidents can make the government work well or poorly. I don't think that they're thinking about what's going on in Congress that much. I think presidents are held accountable by voters for the performance of the whole government, and that's wrong, right? Because they're sharing responsibility with the two other branches. But that's often how people perceive what's happening and who they hold accountable when things are going poorly. So I think that any sort of Democratic candidate could say, well, it is true that there are some maybe people are unhappy with what we're able to accomplish, but once we get a Democrat in office, we'll be able to pass the kind of legislation that's popular with voters, and then they can sort of run through their list of 10 agenda items that they wanted to get passed, but were somehow derailed because there was a Republican in the White House. And then that sort of diffuses this idea that somehow their low approval ratings is a problem.
Leaving out the fact that President Bush is vetoing the most important things the Democrats are trying to put through, do you think there's anything else they could be doing right now to appeal more to their base?
Well, I think there are lots of red meat items that they could use to appeal to their base. One of the things that's been more common lately is what we call blame game politics, which is you put pieces of legislation forward that are going to be vetoed, or are going to be put Republican candidates in an awkward position if they have to say publicly what their positions are, because they're not the majority opinion on those things. And so I wouldn't be surprised at all if, as the election draws closer, the agenda is shaped strategically with certain types of issues that will force Republican candidates to make public their unpopular positions.
Moving on to the legacy of George W. Bush, do you think he's shown at all throughout his presidency that he cares about his legacy?
I think that I would say yes. He's not. What's the alternative if he doesn't care about his legacy? Well, I guess his alternative would be that he maybe cares about base political things, or he cares about approval ratings on a more day-to-day basis. I think it's pretty clear he doesn't care about his day-to-day approval ratings, and in some ways the way he's gone about his decision-making, particularly in foreign policy, suggests, I think, an audacity and an adventuresomeness which suggests that he's really thinking he's making the right policy in the long run. And you can agree or disagree with that assessment, but my impression is that that's kind of how he's making his decisions. I think, look, I think that what he thinks, what he believes, is that one, that if in 15 years Iraq is democratic and stable, people are going to reevaluate his presidency, and they're going to evaluate it much more highly than they do now. Two, he thinks that if on his watch nuclear weapons are developed in Iran, people are going to evaluate his presidency much worse. And so he's taking decisions that are politically unpopular now, I think, with an eye towards his assessment of how people are going to evaluate him in the future. And history will tell us whether those were good decisions or bad decisions.
All right, and we have your book. It's coming out soon, The Politics of Presidential Appointments, Political Control, and Bureaucratic Performance. Could you describe some of the topics that are brought up in the book?
Yeah, so the book is, strangely enough, it's a book about the politicization of the bureaucracy. And so what it tries to do is explain the causes and consequences of politicization. So it takes Katrina as its starting point and FEMA's performance there, and it says, how come FEMA had so many political appointees? How did somebody like Michael Brown get in charge of FEMA? Is what's happening in FEMA happening across the government, or is it happening in some places and not in others? And then it says, and did the effect of appointees on performance in FEMA during Katrina, is that relationship more generally true across the government? And so it takes kind of a big picture look at how presidents make decisions about politicizing the bureaucracy. When do they do it? Why do they do it? Where do they do it? And what effects does it have on performance? And obviously it has a lot of relevance to the current administration because there have been lots of accounts of it happening here. But it sort of puts this administration in the context of previous administrations, including Democratic administrations that also politicized.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Make sure you pick up a copy of Mr. Lewis's book when it comes out in April, and tune into On the Issues next week. I'm Nicholas Ballasy, and thanks for watching.